to this session. My name is David Svoboda. I'm a historian working at the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Systems. And let me welcome you. We are very grateful that you are here with us today. It's also a big pleasure to introduce Professor Jurije Fjodorova on my left, who is the author of his let's say provocative book Russia between Fascism and Disintegration. And my colleague Jan Šír, an assistant professor from the Faculty of Social Sciences of the Charles University, dealing with the post-communist space, with Eastern Europe, also the author of a monography, The Russian Aggression Against Ukraine. On my right is sitting political and security analyst Mychajlo Samus, a Ukrainian guy whom you can frequently see or hear in Czech media, if I'm not wrong, and providing us with this perfect knowledge of the security situation in Ukraine and in eastern Ukraine and so on. Let me also welcome His Excellence, the Ukrainian ambassador to the Czech Republic, Yevhen. And I would also like to add that we are very grateful for the parliamentary library being provided to us so that this action can take place in such a prestigious space, let's say. Before giving the floor to speakers, just allow me to make a short remark on the given subject, as Russia has become a fervently discussed topic not only in the Czech media. And nobody can doubt that Czech Republic and also other countries from the region and Europe as a whole find themselves in a deep political crisis. There has been much talk about to what extent Russia is banking on the inner weaknesses of Western societies. And simply Vladimir Putin's regime has become a sort of enigma, a mystery for many people. Here in Czech Republic, we've got quite many self-proclaimed Russia experts doing their best to convince us that Russia is a state in a perfect shape, which should be feared, which should get its just place on the international stage. And they simply tend to stress that we should somewhat fear Russia, that we should cave into its demands. On the other hand, if I'm not wrong, Mr. Fjodorova and this book is trying to tell that maybe we could and should fear Russia, but not only because of our inner weaknesses, but also for Russia's inner weakness, which can lead to a fascist and disintegration scenario. And it's an irony, and I'm anxious to hear Mr. Fyodorov's remarks and his today's message. Then I will give the floor to my colleagues who are likely to speak a much shorter time. Mr. Fjodorov, thank you. And
thank you very much indeed. Vážené dámy a pánové, pro mě je velkým privilegiem být tady a prezentovat svůj názor na hlavní trendy rozvoje Ruska, fašismus a rozpad. Bohužel můj český jazyk je příliš špatný, já budu pokračovat v angličtině, pokud vám to nevadí. Thank you. Děkuji vám. I would like to begin by thanking Dr. Jan Šír from Institute of International Studies of the Charles University and Dr. David Svoboda from Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes who organized this event, which is really important for me. I very much hope that I will have a lot of criticism and a lot of feedback from you, ladies and gentlemen, which will be really very helpful for me. And of course, I'm saying special words of appreciation to Kyiv-based Center for Army Conversion and Disarmament Studies, and especially to my friends and I would say colleagues from this center, Pani Samus and Pani Kuchak, who published this book, Russia Between Fascism and Disintegration, the book which we are discussing here and now. As I understand, as always, I have not a lot of time, so I'll outline some basic points only. Let me start by saying that for many of us, it is difficult to accept that Russia is moving towards fascism, or even that the current Russian regime is a fascist one. Current Russian regime, which sometimes called as Putinism, or perhaps fascism with a Russian face. I especially think with Russian face, not with Putin's face, because I think that there are a lot of internal factors, internal processes that are leading and resulting in Russia sliding to fascism. I'm sure that many Russians, I think that vast majority of Russians would strongly disagree with that, with the fact that Russia is moving towards fascism. And not only Russians, but also a lot of you Western scholars and people from Western political milieu, from Western intellectual circles, and so on. And of course, there could be various reasons for that. We may discuss those reasons, if you wish, a little bit later. But however, I think that it is important to call things by their proper names, to call a spade, and to say that there are some dangerous trends in Russia's domestic politics which are resulting in fascist transformation of the political system. Well, to answer the question, whether Putinism is a sort of fascism or not, we have to look at distinguishing features of fascist regimes. There are, of course, we all know that there are, I think, about 100 definitions of fascism. What is fascism? What is fascist regimes? What is fascist movements? It's really very interesting intellectual debates and intellectual discussions about the nature and manifestations of fascism. And of course, fascism has a lot of faces. Nazism in Germany, fascist regime in Italy under Mussolini, some regimes which sometimes are called fascist, like Franco regime in Spain or Salazar regime in Portugal. However, I tried to summarize some points, some distinguishing features which, in my understanding, are more or less common to all fascist regimes. First of all, it's personalist dictatorship, often tyrannical, relying on security apparatus. Secondly, the social-political basis of such regimes includes large portions of middle and lower classes, not only the top circles. Thirdly, it pursues economic dirigism with a view to put the economic system based on private property at service of state. And what is the most important point, what is the most important definition of fascism is that it is motivated by by ideology that combines glorification of the past, cult of great leaders, brackets, heroic myth, a concept of permanent sacred war between the motherland of the country in which this regime is rising and existing, and external and internal enemies. It claims to represent interests of the nation as a whole. It based on the image of nation, state, or race as the supreme and eternal realities and values. It's also characteristic by the cult of tradition and traditional values that had been lost during the historic development of the country and of the society. Glorification of a state is also typical of such regimes. States that prevails over an individual and personalities, physically and spiritually. It's typical for those regimes that they are militant anti-liberalism, liberalist and anti-Westernist. And the question is whether Putin's regime has something in common with such definitions, with such picture of. I think yes. I think that really, in fact, Putin's regime has a number of essential characteristics typical of those which I've mentioned just before. Of course, it's personalist dictatorship centered around Vladimir Putin. As for economic dirigism, I would say that key positions in Russia's economic system are held by state-owned corporations that control the critical industries. In the Russian state propaganda, particular importance is given to the idea of the unity of the people, which claims that ethnicity and being part of the Russian people prevails over any social and class differences. Well, it's really something that has something in common with the Nazist regime, in fact, with the Nazist view of relationship between social groups and the state and the ethnicity. Ethnicity or race, which is typical for fascism ideology, fascism views on the life, is that it's prevailing over social differences. And unfortunately, Putin's dictatorship rests on the support of 80–85% of people, at least studies of Russia's public opinion polls shows that. And Putinism as an ideological system also includes, I think, almost all elements of fascist ideology, which I've mentioned before: cult of leaders, cult of heroic myth, cult of state, and so on and so forth. I shall not repeat it once again. The question is whether fascism is happened, or is Russia is moving towards fascism only a few years ago, or perhaps something in Russian society is supporting this trend. I would say that fascism as an ideology, at least, is not something new for Russia. What is more, it was Russia, the country in which the first fascist or proto-fascist movement in Europe, so-called Black Hundreds, has arisen in the early 20th century and this movement became an important player in Russia's political life in the middle of 19th century. Well, this movement, the Black Hundreds, is usually viewed as an outburst of extremist activity, which is largely manifested as an anti-Semitic pogroms carried out by lumpen proletariat and lower middle classes, provoked by then Russian political police that tried to channel social discontent towards the Jewish population of the empire. It is undisputed, of course, that Black Hundreds was a main force of anti-Jewish pogroms of the early 20th century. It looks like that the militant anti-Semitism typical of Nazism was borrowed from the Black Hundreds teachings. For instance, a tragically known anti-Semitic fake was created by the Black Hundred circles, so-called protocols of the elders of Zion, which later became the handbook of the Hitler's Germany. It was this fake has been created by Russian imperial political police, as far as I know. However, the Black Hundred movement did not only span the lower social classes, but included members of all classes and groups, including many prominent members of then Russian intellectuals. And most importantly, the fact that its socio-political doctrine included many fascist, typically fascist elements. For instance, I would mention the idea of a monarch who would be installed as an undisputable leader. That was one of the main points, main elements of Black Hundredist ideology. The power of a leader, in Russia's case, then the power of the emperor or Tsar, would not be limited by laws or institutions. Such monarchic leader mania, I would say, was considered as the only political order suitable for Russia due to specific of the Russian mentality and historical development, as the ideologists of this movement had said. Any limitation of the monarch leader's power was viewed as an encroachment against the fundamental principles of Russian statehood. Shortly speaking, in the first decade of the 20th century, a large part of the Russian society was ready to establish a fascist regime in an orthodox monarchist form. So the roots of current fascization of Russia, if I may say that, has emerged somewhere more than 100 years ago. Well, there is a very interesting history of evolution of fascist and Nazist, neo-Nazist, quasi-Nazist groups and thinking, both in the former Soviet Union. There was some, and as well within the Russian emigration in Europe and in the United States between the two world wars. It's very interesting, but I haven't time to mention the details of such evolution, of its evolution. But let me say that the next very important step in the evolution of Russian fascism began in 1960s. Then fascist and proto-fascist views were spreading through the artistic intelligentsia in Russia, in the former Soviet Union, largely among the writers and journalists clustered around a few magazines published by the Central Committee of Komsomol, of the Young Communist League. Gradually, those views spread through the student communities, the technical intelligentsia, the army officer corps, and the state security agencies, the clergy of the Russian Orthodox Church, and the party apparatus. At the core, these views were a kind of initial form of Russian fascist and extra right-wing nationalist ideology. In brief, they come down to the following. I would like to mention the main points of these views. how eclectic, although they were very hectic and eclectic combination of different views borrowed from many sources. Simply because these views are typical, to my mind, to a large part of Russian political elites and intellectual circles at the moment. Well, they said that the West, primarily the United States, is the imminent enemy of Russia or the Soviet Union and of the Russian civilization founded on Eastern Orthodox values, an enemy that strives to weaken and ultimately destroy Russia. In many ways, the West's anti-Russian policy, they said, was inspired by Zionist circles who hate Russia for being the main power standing in the way of the Zionism world domination. It looks absolutely ugly, but it was so, unfortunately. They also said that the Bolshevik Revolution was a result of the Jewish conspiracy. After coming to power, the Bolsheviks, acting on order of the Zionist circles, had systematically worked to destroy the Russian civilization and the Russian way of life. Stalin, they said, managed to change the nature of the Soviet regime, giving it a Russian national character and limiting the influence of those malicious groups and circles among the Soviet elite. But after Stalin's death, they said, two groups have been battling within the Soviet establishment. The pro-West liberal, well, liberal in brackets, I would say, largely ethnically Jewish group related to international Jewish circles, and the opposing Russian group fighting to preserve the USSR as a force that opposes both American and the Western world hegemony. Well, and they said that the Eastern Orthodox branch of Christianity and the Russian Orthodox Church, to use modern terminology, were the pivotal spiritual and international tenets, so-called skreps in Russian, skrepi, of the Russian society that ensures its unity, social and political stability, and ability to withstand the destructive ideological influences coming from Europe. And unfortunately, those concepts, if I may name those hectic views as concept, became later and now a main part of the Putinism, of Putinists' ideology, Putinists' way of thinking. That's a history, however. What is going on now? I think that there are four trends worthwhile to be mentioned here. First, a large number of fascist and neo-Nazist groups emerged in the late 80s and early 90s, are mostly marginalized, and became a conglomerate of loud organizations that have achieved no success in public policy. That's a good news. However, a few new organizations, fully controlled by the authorities, have emerged and turned into a sort of Putin's Sturm auf Table. I would like to mention, for instance, so-called National Liberation Movement, Национальное освободительное движение, or NOD in Russian, headed by a Duma member, the people with the same surname as me, Jurije Fjodorova, unfortunately. But I have nothing in common with this gentleman. Second trend is establishment of a system of private or semi-private political clubs or networks that brought together various politicians, businessmen, Russian Orthodox Church hierarchs, high-ranking retired army and security officers, who retained, unfortunately, connections with their colleagues in service. And the main mission of these networks, clubs, is to develop conceptual and geopolitical views and concepts with a view to transform Putinism into an operational doctrine which can be used in practical way on which Russian foreign and domestic policy could be based. I would like to mention some of those organizations which are more or less known in Russia's political circles and intellectual circles, such as so-called Izborsky Klub, Academy of Geopolitics, very interesting, in fact, organization headed by a former high-rank officer of Russian General Staff, General Leonid Ivashov, may be known for some of you here, or so-called St. Basil the Great Foundation headed by Russian oligarch Konstantin Malafeyev, which played, unfortunately, a very destructive role at the first stages of Russian intervention in Ukraine. Third trend is that the Russian Orthodox Church plays a special part in development of just mentioned ideas and is transforming into an apparatus of ideological control. And the clergy evolves into a powerful political force, actively penetrating into army, education sphere, and so on. And at last, and I think the most dangerous trend is the growing likelihood of transformation of a soft fascist regime, which I think the current Putin's regime is, into a hard fascist regime. What are the reasons of that? In my view, Putin is losing its political potential. He made a number of strategic blunders that are, as we know, worse than a crime. His being in power for the next 6 years more, and more contradicts interests of a growing part of Russian nomenclatura and big business. Putin cannot but understand that and is afraid of being made a scapegoat. And with all good reasons for that, because if he is losing power and steps out of the Kremlin, then a new leader, in my view, most probably will make Putin responsible for all problems and troubles started not only in 2014 when Putin invaded into Ukraine, but a serious, perhaps not a great, but serious economic troubles and losing a probability, losing a chance to improve, to build modern Russian industry and modern Russian economy in a period when Russia was enjoying a flow of petrodollars. So, to avoid this not very pleasant perspective for Putin, he, as some well-informed Russian observers believe, plans to change the constitution to become a lifelong leader, and this logically leads to establishment a hard fascist dictatorship based on just mentioned ideology. Well, so it's not a good news for all of us. And I think not a good news not only for Russians, but also for Europe, because fascist regimes are known to pursue an expansionist and militant policy outside of its borders. Well, the second trajectory of Russia's development is a separatist trend resulting in the final end in the disintegration of the country. However paradoxical or ironical it may appear, an attempt to establish a hardline fascist dictatorship in Russia may and most likely will result in its disintegration. In my view, it's an important point, I think. Well, let's look what has happened with Russia's with relationship between so-called regions in Russia and the central institutions, central authorities. Advocates of Putin believe that one of his key political achievements was to prevent the fracturing of Russia by quelling so-called centrifugal tendencies and separatist sentiments in the region. They said that Putin saved Russia from disintegration somewhere in the very beginning of his first tenure. It's only true, in fact, that Putin had formally preserved Chechnya as a part of Russia or the Russian Federation, while de facto renouncing control over the territory of this so-called republic, amended the legislation of the next point. He amended the legislation of several Russian republics, such as Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, Tuva, and some others, to exclude provisions in their constitution about the priority of republic laws over the federal ones. And of course, Putin strongly increased the region's dependency on the federal center. Thus, the Kremlin has removed external manifestations of regional and ethno-regional separatism without addressing its underlying causes. Well, let's look at some views of Russian population. Many Russians believe that regional separatism is a real threat to the country and the country's integrity, which means that they believe that separatism or regional separatism is really existing and is an important factor, important albeit negative factor of current situation. Well, some public opinion surveys showed that about 1/2 of Russians view separatism as a substantial problem, about 1/2 of the population. Most of the respondents, about 80%, held negative views about the prospect of separation of any regions from Russia. 9%, however, has now a positive stance on the possible parceling of the country. It's those figures are typical for all national sample. Well, sources and prerequisites of separatism in Russia lies in three main spheres, three main processes. Firstly, interests of regional elites which strive to lessen their dependence on the central government. Regional elites would like to be more independent, of course, as many regional elites all over the world. Also, the second process is discontent of regional elites, especially those of so-called donor regions, regions which are producing the main part of Russian wealth, economic wealth, because they are strongly dissatisfied with the current budgetary system. And the system is that the central government simply takes the major part of incomes, of wealth produced by those regions and distribute it as its only want. And also, it's another point which is not so obvious as to previous ones, Well, it's, I would say that cultural and value-based and psychological differences among people of the same ethnicity, in this case Russians, that live in different regions are different. Because they have roots far, and these differences have rooted in the past that define its possible lines. Well, some people would say, and some Russian analysts and scholars, they simply said that, well, Siberians, people living in Siberia, are quite different from people living in so-called Central Russia. People living in the southern areas of Russia are quite different from the people living in the northern part of Russia because of different history and so on. Even different ethnic roots. I would say that, for instance, some roots, some of those differences are rooted in social history, because, for instance, Siberians, there was no serfdom in Siberia, unlike the situation in Central Russia. So Siberians psychologically may be more close to the American Wild West, Far West, than to some areas in Central Russia. At least some Siberian intellectuals believe that. Well, but prerequisites are prerequisites, and the question is whether those prerequisites could be realized can be realized, and then to find how it can happen, how it may happen, we, I think, should look at the question how empires had crashed. And the dissolution of so-called territorially integrated empires were largely caused by a combination of factors. At least the dissolution of the Russian Empire in the beginning of the last century, as well as the dissolution and disintegration of the Soviet Union at the end of the last century. First factor is a rise of national movements and aspirations, on the one hand, and the second factor is weakening and paralysis of the central government on the other. So a combination of those two factors may result in disintegration of a state or the country. The paralysis of the center may create a power vacuum, and regional elites step up to fill it, either willingly, as they try to break free from the center and control the economic and political institutions of their region, or simply to prevent the collapse of the governance system, simply to prevent the collapse of the government, and to control the social political crisis and chaos in the respective region. So there could be two parallel factors, motivations of regional elites. Well, the crisis of the central government in current Russian situation, and now I'm moving towards the last part of my, I think, too long presentation. So, what may cause the rise of disintegration factors within Russia today? Why the central government, the central decision-making body can be disabled? First of all, because of rise of disagreements and controversies within the ruling elite caused by Putin's attempt to establish his long-life fascist type of dictatorship. I do not think that all Russian elites, all Russian establishment, bureaucratic nomenclatura, big business, commanders of army and security forces would be happy with that, partly because This trend may result in mass cadre reshuffling, mass cadre denying, and so on. Second scenario could be exacerbation of the economic crisis, either as a result of oil prices dropping or economic sanctions by the West. In this case, the fault line in the Russian political and business establishment is likely to run between the advocates of a Soviet-type mobilization economy as a way out of the crisis, and the proponents of radical market reforms, military spending cuts, and government intervention in the economy. So different views and different economic interests of different groups of nomenclatura in big business may result in conflicts within the narrow ruling circles, which prevents the circle to pursue more or less coherent policy. Many authors, Russian authors, believe that an economic crisis will fuel separatist sentiments, especially in the North Caucasus, whose interest in staying a part of Russia will fall as the budget subsidies to the regions of this part of the country decrease. The other source of disabling the decision-making center could be mass protests in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and a few other major cities, with the demands for Putin resignation. This may be followed by disputes on who should be the successor, and power struggle within various groups within the top echelon of the government. And there could be two reasons, two causes of deep internal political crisis in Russia, caused by Russia's adventurism in the international arena. I think that attempts by Russia to occupy the Baltic countries, which is maybe not very probable, but at least a realistic prospect, and its defeat in a short-term conventional clash with NATO forces may result in schism of the top echelons of power that can arise from disagreements on the prospect of further military escalation that may result in a nuclear conflict. One part of Russian establishment, political establishment, military command, and so on, may support further escalation of conflict with NATO, with a view to push NATO to a situation when it has either to rise the escalation to a nuclear level or to recognize its defeat. But while another part of establishment may view quite different attitudes, may have quite different attitudes, they simply fear that such development may result in nuclear catastrophe and nuclear destruction of Russia. And the next reason, or the next cause of Russia's of the disablement of Russia's decision-making center could rise from a so-called large war with Ukraine, just because different groups in Russia's political and bureaucratic top circles may have different views, different interests, and different prospects on what may result from such war. Well, I think my time is over, and I would like to stop here and to thank you for your attention.
Interesting lesson, lecture, and now I would like to Jan Šír.
Thank you, David. Excellent. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be here, and I would like to thank the organizers, first of all, the Parlamentní Library, for providing us with these fantastic premises. It's my pleasure being here. I do apologize, I will be very, very short today because I do not feel quite good, and you can hear it in my voice here. And still, I'm not the main star here this evening. So, is Russia fascist? I mean, this question is far from rhetoric. This is far from academic. This is a question that has very practical repercussions, not only for the Russians, but also for us here in Europe. And in this respect, I would like to point to the mere fact that following Russia's domestic developments is absolutely crucial for understanding Russia's foreign policy behavior. And we have a war in Europe, in Ukraine. We had the instance that one state annexed the territory of another state. This was the first instance of annexation of a territory of a foreign state in Europe after 1945. Just to contextualize the huge shifts or very dynamic process of foreign policy behavior in Russia. And as I already said, my argument is that I think that the key to understanding this behavior is inside Russia, in the processes which are going on there, in politics, first of all. And this has very much to do with the ongoing fascization of Russia's ruling regime. I would like to stop at foreign policy and try to at least touch upon the link between domestic processes in Russia and Russia's foreign policy behavior, because I am convinced that what we are witnessing now in Ukraine, this is no isolated event. This is no accident. This is no misunderstanding. This is no emotional reaction or response by Mr. Putin to the fact that his client regime simply fell in Ukraine. This is really part of a broader strategic agenda of Russia aimed at critical destabilization of international rules-based order. So, destabilization of Ukraine, this is not an end in itself. It's just part of more complex offensive, including also military means and methods, in order to bring the existing international rules-based system to a collapse. Why I think so? I think that Russia's source of frustration has very little to do with losing geopolitical positions, strategic encirclement by NATO and all these kind of stuff, which are very often emerging when discussing what we call in the West here Ukraine crisis. Russia's source of frustration is its unfinished modernization, which would require reforms. And Russia, in the current international setting, is simply not competitive, which creates huge pressures on ruling regime, because the legitimacy gap becomes obvious and visible. So, if you take economy, Russia's share in world GDP fell below 2%, if I'm not wrong.
1.7.
1.7, it's more or less GDP of Spain. We are not talking about GDP per capita. We are talking in total. Can you play big politics with these economic strength? This is a rhetorical question. I'm not sure. Take the domain of high tech. Russia has some technology in some areas. Nuclear rocket, maybe. But what else? I mean, is it enough for playing big policy? That's a question. Culturally, I'm not sure whether Russia, in its current setting, is that attractive. Yes, we see that Putin's regime has many followers in Europe, mostly from the right, far right, and fringe parties and elements. But still, it's not a mainstream in the West. And Russia is facing serious problems at home. And the only way for preventing the necessary changes which Putin has to do, or would have to do, is to simply destroy the rules which led to the situation that Russia, when playing according to rules, is not competitive. I would stop here and pass the floor to Misha, and I very much hope that if you do not agree with me, you will have a chance to raise that issue in the Q&A session, which will follow in a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Honza, and Mychajlo, it's your turn.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to say thanks for organizers and personally to Jan Šír for support our idea to present this book in Prague. And of course, I'd like to thank to Dr. Fjodorova for writing this book, because I think it's very timely and very important. Even this time, even we started to think about this book a couple of years ago. But I think the importance of this book just started to be only now, at this moment, as important we wanted to apply for current situation. I like to support Jan Šír sentences and points on why we should pay attention what going to be or what is going in Russia inside, because we understand that this country with these trends inside and foreign behavior could be a threat and challenge not only for Ukraine, which is in military conflict with Russia, and we have problems with this country every second, let's say, because Ukrainian soldiers died every moment, and we should know about it. War doesn't stop now, war is continuing. And for example, I'd like to say that when we studied last strategic exercises, Zapad or West 2017, last autumn, we understood that Russia is ready to use nuclear weapon in Europe, tactical or even strategic against the United States, but scenario was built like that nuclear weapon could be an instrument of de-escalation, not escalation of conflict, but de-escalation of conflict. It means that Russia will use nuclear weapon when the West, for example, NATO, won't complete the demands on Russia, for example, in Baltic states, or in Poland, or in Ukraine. I would underline that all of geopolitical theories by Russia, they now could rule to destroying current international order. I'd like to support Jan Šír's opinion that to allow Russia, without any significant economical potential, or great potential, but let's say current situation with the economy, competitiveness of Russian economy, to use different style, different instruments to make a house around the world and try to put a new international order in which Russia could play together with how they call the international orchestra of nation with a great nation, and smaller nation just need to listen what the biggest or bigger country will say. What else? I like to I'm not going to speak long. I just want to give maybe some food for discussion and give some new and maybe comic, but maybe paradoxical details on the regime what is created in Russia. In January 18th, in State Duma, it's a Russian parliament, the new movie Blockade Blood Genetics has been presented, and the main idea of this movie that the horrors of the German blockade in Leningrad during the Second World War left a mutation on the genetic code of survivors that was passed into their progeny, including a preternatural sense of civic responsibility. And Putin, born in Leningrad later, has got the golden gene. It's not a joke, it's not anecdote or something like fantasy. It's a serious kind of scientific movie which is presented in State Duma and by Russian Culture Ministry. And the main idea of this movie that Putin and his team, because they told in the movie that, for example, Moscow Patriarch Kirill, head of Party Spravedliva Rossiya Sergei Mironov, General Sergei Ivanov, head of Russian Foreign Intelligence Sergei Naryshkin, as well have golden gene because of their survivors or the children of survivors of people who survive in blockade. And in parallel, now Kremlin share ideas that Putin not only has golden gene, but he belongs to all generation of old Orthodox Church. It's Starover. It's the older Orthodox Church, which actually exists now in parallel to new Orthodox Church. They are talking about it. Why are they talking about it? Because they think that Starover has special set of tradition and rules. For example, collectivism, close, strict moral, and even special business principles. I would say it's like special rules like in mafia. So it's kind of different rules from the state, rules and different rules from other people. So even, and they told that Starover could be a new basement for new Russian scrappy, these braces of tenets, which is more right braces than normal Orthodox Church. And Putin, who was born, again, sometimes, I have at least three variants of his biography. He was born in Georgia, in Leningrad, or in Tver Oblast. So if he was born in Tver Oblast, it means that he's some kind of belongs to generation of Starover, and means that he is has special. Again, they told it high level of civic responsibility. Even it's very difficult to understand what does it mean. But instead, they told that, for example, prostitutes, they have a low level of civic responsibility. So it could something like compare to this. It's possible to understand what does it mean. Actually, one more remark what we should understand, why we should care about what's going on inside of Russia, because every day current Russia, current regime violate human rights of people in Crimea, and a lot of people, dozens, hundreds of Ukrainians, which is detained on the territory of Russia. And to conclude my short remark, I'd like to say again our strong word of support to our colleague Ukrainian journalist Roman Sushenko, who illegally detained on the territory of Russia. And we demand that Russian regime free Roman Sushenko, as well as other Ukrainian political prisoners of the Kremlin. And we call on the international community to take all possible steps to release and return all Ukrainian citizens detained and legally detained in Russia. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank our guests. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it's your turn. And so if you would like to ask any questions, just raise your hand and the microphone will come to you as quickly as possible. So.
Thanks very much for that very stimulating presentation. Really, there are many things I could raise. I just want to keep myself to two. One is, I was curious about this teleological presentation. Somehow, a tendency towards fascism was somehow baked into Russian culture. Because surely, looking at the sort of the pre-revolutionary factors you're talking about, and indeed the 1960s and so forth onwards, this would apply equally to Ukraine as it would to the Russian Federation. So, I mean, I'd be curious if you could tease that one out. But mainly, it's this idea of ethnicity, Russian ethnicity, being part of the Putin regime. I mean, I absolutely agree that there are many characteristics of the Putin regime which do look worryingly fascistic, especially in the sort of the Mussolini-esque corporatist state model. However, of all the many criticisms one can levy against Putin, what actually hasn't really been said is actually that this is a man who, he believes in a Russian state. He is an absolute sort of ultra-nationalist for the Russian state. But in fact, he definitely does not display the anti-Semitism that is still a very disappointing part of Russian culture. When we have seen race riots and so forth, such as at the Února and so forth, actually the state tends to come down quite hard on it. And I mean, he very clearly makes an effort to ensure that non-ethnic Russian elites in Tatarstan, in the North Caucasus, and elsewhere, actually are treated with good respect and so forth. So I mean, I was wondering if you could actually explain a bit more why you present this as being some kind of ethnic Russian proto-fascism.
Thank you very much for this. I think one of the key questions in debates about Russia's future, the nature of Russia's regime, and of Russia's culture and so on, whether fascism is rooted in Russian political culture or it's something else. It's really not fully answered questions as yet. There are different views. I agree with that, well, we can, but anyhow, we have to say what is Russia's regime. Not saying some, well, I think political, not to be very deep in political theory, speaking about hybrid nature of the regime and so on, but the key question is in fact, whether Putin's regime is fascist or not. Well, now let's look at anti-Semitism. You are absolutely correct that in the beginning of the last century, anti-Semitism was a very serious, I would say, perhaps more rough. The Jewish population of the former Russian Empire was seen by many influential circles within Russia's not only political elites, but also within intellectual elites. I can provide a lot of names of famous scientists, artists, and so on, writers. But, well, the nature of this phenomena was that regime was looking for an internal enemy. And internal enemy then were Jewish population, or some part of Jewish population, you know. Now, the internal enemy for many Russians are people coming from the southern part of the former Soviet Union or from the Northern Caucasus, etc., etc., Well, but machinery of the process is the same. They are seen as internal enemies. You are quite right saying that Putin himself perhaps is not anti-Semitic. It's true. But however, I don't know whether he is so or not. I simply don't know, and nobody knows, perhaps beside Putin himself. So he is only a person who knows better about those things, what he thinks in fact about who is the main enemy. But anyhow, the general machinery is the same. There are internal enemies. In this case, ethnically, they may be people coming, migrants from southern part of the country, Muslims, or so on. While also internal enemies, which is typical for many fascist regimes, are liberals, which is perhaps also very dangerous characteristic of the processes going on in Russia. So internal enemies, and you may find a lot of confirmations of this sad fact, is seen, internal enemies are treated as liberals. Liberals who are paid by the West, who are paid by the United States, who are paid by those circles outside of Russia, who decided to destroy Russia. The same type of thinking, the same way of thinking as it was at the end of 19th century, at the beginning of 20th century, and the same way of thinking now. That is my view, my understanding of this problem.
Who else? Really? No questions?
No interest.
Markéta Doležalová, ÚSTR. Maybe I may make one remark from the point of religion and the Orthodox Church and some people within Orthodox Church, I mean one man, whose fate can show us that the proto, but maybe fascist or nationalist features of Russian society were present even at early Gorbachev times and Yeltsin times. The name of the man is Alexander Mann, who was of Jewish origin and was a convertee to Orthodox Church, but he was at the same time a communist with low contacts with Catholic Church outside Russia. And he was murdered just at the early Yeltsin times, and nobody can explain this murder. And he was very influential and has a lot of supporters among young people and very open people, accepting Western liberal thoughts and so on. That's only one remark. Thank you very much.
Added something.
Yeah, if I may. You're absolutely correct that Father Alexander Mann was a prominent figure, not only in Russian Orthodox Church, but also in Russian society, I suppose, former Soviet society, in Russian society. But I would say that he is a rare bird in the church hierarchy. While the main part of current, I cannot say clergy at all, but church hierarchy is a hierarchy that centered around the Moscow Patriarchy. Well, it's very, this organization is really a very disciplined one. and they pushed out people who shared a little bit different views on the role of religious, the role of church in society. There are, of course, as in any religion, there are a lot of people who would like to make good things and to fight evil, of course. But I was speaking largely about the hierarchy, Moscow patriarchy, that created such hierarchy and is choosing the proper, from their point of view, proper people to put them in proper places.
Thank you.
You briefly mentioned these nationalist groups such as the National Liberation Movement, which the other groups in Russia as well, like Officers of Russia. And I'd just like to hear your opinions on how important these groups are, how kind of related to the Kremlin, how official the links are, and are they kind of useful idiots in a way, or are they maybe potentially a threat to come? Because, like we saw in 2013 with the crackdown on ultranationalists, and now these groups, have they kind of served their purpose and are now getting a little bit too big for their boots, or are they an irrelevance and not really worth thinking about?
Thank you. Well, what can I say? There are a lot of small groups, very loud, mostly controlled by the special services or security services. If to call them, it's the Federal Service of Security and the so-called Center E of the Internal Ministry, which is designed to fight with extremist groups. But they are not, those institutions or services, basically they do not fight those groups, at least most of them, but they try to use them as an instrument against liberal-minded or opposition politicians. And that is quite effective instrument, because those people from those groups, some of them are controlled, or not controlled, but associated with the Patriarchy of the Russian Orthodox Church, some of them not. But they are really, it's an effective instrument, useful for the authorities to, at the moment, not to suppress opposition movements, opposition leaders, opposition groups, but to terrorize them. Also, the situation is not so simple in actual fact, because some of those groups in 2014 supported Ukraine, because they thought that it's a criminal enterprise from the Kremlin to unleash a war against the brother nation, against the Slavic nation, and so on. But it was a minority of those groups. Most of them supported Putin's intervention into Ukraine and the war against Ukraine. Now, what is more dangerous, in my understanding, are groups and networks within intellectual and political and bureaucratic elites, which I have mentioned in the presentation.
I could add a couple of words about this, because, for example, Национальное освободительное движение, we've been in Minsk, in Belarus, when studied looking at the exercise Запад 2017, and we saw on the evening in the Minsk, the center of the Minsk, and a huge column on the cars is symbolic of Nod, with great portraits of Putin, with slogans, "It's our land." And so we understood it kind of hybrid instrument on the background of the exercise, which is, remember, if you know about the exercise with some very kind of comic Vaishnaria lands and different scenarios, but it looked like a demonstration that this is Russian land and Belarus is already occupied, and Belarus is territory of, at least for military use, is Russian land. So I think this nationalistic group under control of secret services could be an effective instrument, and we saw it a lot of examples when they occupied Crimea and Donbass. You could remember the Orthodox army, you could remember even Yurkin, which is actually, it's a fascist, because if you study his understanding of the situation in Ukraine and the role of Russia in geopolitics, it's absolutely fascist understanding of the situation. That they could say that it's like monarchy and nationalist group, but okay, it depends how we call it. But I support Dr. Fyodorov's opinion that this is a huge and great instrument, effective instrument, internal and external for Putin now.
Good evening, my name is Maciej Bibi. I'm also from the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regime. My question is for Mr. Fjodorov. What do you think of the apparent beginning struggle within the Russian elites, both political and economic? Does it somehow support your prediction of potential further fascization of the Russian political system? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would wish to know what is going on within the Kremlin, but Kremlin has very thick walls and a very small amount of information are coming from it. However, generally speaking, there are a few trends in fact. First trend is that previously, before I think 2015, those groups, sometimes they were called as the towers of the Kremlin, Russian, Kremlin, Russian. They were fighting with each other or struggling with each other, competing for the closeness to the president. They competing to be as close to the Putin's ear as only possible. Now they are fighting, they are struggling on the personality of successor. And that is, I think, much more dividing factor, because there are different, you may find in mass media different names of possible successors. One is coming from so-called Siloviks or power agencies. Another could be Mr. Kudrin, who believed to be the head of so-called system liberals, or liberal economists, liberal in brackets, I would say, and some other personalities, some other figures. However, I think that now the main dividing line within Russian nomenclature, bureaucratic nomenclature, and big business and so on, are lying between proponents of an aggressive policy towards the West and those who believe that it's really very, very dangerous, both for them personally and for the country, for different reasons, but mainly because they understand quite well that Russia is not able to compete with the West in peaceful terms, economically, in science, and so on. The only factor Russia has, the only instrument Russia's elite has, as Jan has said, is nuclear weapon. But that is a very dangerous instrument. The use of this instrument may have catastrophic consequences, you know, not only for outside world, but for Russia itself. So that deep divergences now, I think the deepening divergences now are lying between those who are against the aggressive policy towards the West, and those who are in favor of this policy, with a view, in particular, to isolate Russia and to establish a kind of repressive, more repressive regimes than before.
May I ask a question to Mr. Fjodorov? What do you think about Chinese position? Maybe there are some secret you see, it's not safe to have such a disintegrated Russian in your bag. What about China? And what do you think?
Well, thanks. Well, I agree with you. I agree with you when you said that it's dangerous for Russia to have such mighty neighbor, and neighbor who is not pro-Russian, I would say, who is not in fact friendly to Russia, partly because Chinese has very good memory, and they remember well about their lands or lands they believe to be Chinese historically, but now the lands which belong to Russia and which have been annexed from China 200 years ago, 100 years ago, and so on. So I do think that Chinese and China will do its best, not now perhaps, because now Beijing has a number of other tasks and missions. But to return those lands and to establish its influence over the Russian Far Eastern region and some parts of Siberia and so on. The question is whether China is really needed for such lands or not, because there are different schools of thoughts in China. Some people in Beijing, as far as I can understand, they believe that, well, let's sit and wait and Russia will disintegrate and those lands will come under our aegis without our serious efforts, without use of force and so on.
Thank you. Perhaps this is too broad an area to bring up. I have two areas that I would like to ask about beyond what's happening in Russia. And that is whether the populist movement, that seems to be growing in so many places, is going to have the same impact, i.e. fascism, as a result. And the other question is relating to technology. And what is it doing? And is it doing something that we aren't able to deal with?
Well, it's a very difficult question, I think. Well, my understanding, if to look at prospects of Russia's prospects and prospects of developments within Russian society, the rise of populist movements within Russia, as I understand it. Well, it's one type of process, one complex of processes. The other is rising technological gap between Russia and the West. Well, but anyhow, there are some connections between those two trends. One is that the growing lag between Russia and the West in high technology and so on may increase a sense of inferiority within Russian society, within some groups in Russian society. So, and those sense of inferiority may result in some kind of very primitive populistic notions and so on.
You spoke earlier about the fragmentation of the Russian state and decentralization. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about what sort of actors might appear whenever or eventually if the state does fragment. Would that be ethnically centric or regionally centric?
Well, if Russia is disintegrating, different stages of disintegration, then of course new forces will appear, especially within regions. Political forces, groups and movements which would like to control the institutions, regional economic assets and so on. There of course will be a lot of debates about the political system of emerging regional entities. Actors. Well, first of all, and the main important, most important actor or actors in those, if this process is going on, is regional elites. And we know very little about political attitudes of regional elites in Russia, in different regions, especially in Siberia, in the Northern Caucasus area and so on. We know that now they are interested in maintaining more or less constructive relations with the center, because otherwise they will be pushed out and their fate will be very sad. However, what they do think really, I think we don't know. Because they prefer not to demonstrate their real thinking, their real interests, their real attitudes. But of course we may suppose that they will behave in favor of more independence from the center, and they would like to be more independent the weaker is the center itself.
I have two questions about possible future. The first one is just related to the previous question. From your point of view, how possible is that say the republic and the ethnic republics would follow the case of the Baltic states as the Baltic states did at the very end of the Soviet Union? This slogan of if I'm not mistaken, follow your own constitution. So basically, federal republics could do that. And the second question is also about the future. How would you evaluate the idea that the system would name the successor, say the Putin 2.0, that Putin would be granted peaceful rest like Yeltsin had when he gave up presidency. And so if, from your point of view, it's possible that Putin can handle his presidency for someone else, someone who will be named from the elites or from the Kremlin court itself. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let's start with the second question, if I may. Really, I do not think that Putin is ready to give the office to anybody else. And there are a lot of good reasons for that. I think that Putin is afraid that any successor, even those very close to him now, will blame Putin on all troubles and all even crimes made during Putin's tenure. That, in my view, is the main factor of Putin's political behavior at the moment, and in nearest future, and in a few years. So that's why Putin is striving for his personal leadership, factual, not formal, but factual leadership, for all his life. Who may be his successor, I don't know, because it can be, it will be, if any successor is appearing, it will be a result of intra-elites consensus. Perhaps it will be a very weak figure, as sometimes happened in history, when a weak figure was treated as not dangerous one for mighty power groups and mighty political groups competing for power. If they cannot agree about some of them becoming the main figures, leader, then they may decide to propose this position to a weakest one, with a view to save the time and solve their problems in more or less calm environment. However, history shows also that such figures, weak figures, sometimes became a very strong one and became a dictator. Well, as for your first question, perhaps you really mind. Baltic scenario. Well, I don't think so at the moment. Because let's look at particular areas. There are two areas which sometimes are seen as potential hotbeds of ethnic separatism. First of all, it's Northern Caucasus. But loyalty of the Northern Caucasus elites to Moscow relies on great subsidies coming from the federal budget to those regions, to those republics, as they call themselves, and mainly those money are coming to the hands of regional leaders and distributed within those their power circles. So the only, in my view, the only possible scenario of disintegration, of secession of the Northern Caucasus republics from Russia, from the Russian Federation, is or will be the decrease in subsidies from the federal side. Then regional elites are losing their main interest to remain in this within the Russian Federation, and they would like to find another sponsors, perhaps from rich Arab states and so on. The other ethnic regions, which sometimes are seen also as potential hotbeds of separatism, are Tatarstan and Bashkortostan, Volga Basin area. However, I think that the probability of secession of those regions, of those republics from the Russian Federation is overestimated at the moment, because, well, first of all, the share of ethnicity, state ethnicity, is not really high. In Tatarstan, I think that Tatars are, well, they are the majority group, but in absolute terms, in absolute figures, they are less than half of the population. In Bashkortostan, the situation is the same. And a lot of Tatars are living in Russia, in so-called Russian regions, in Moscow and some other all over the country. More than half of Tatars are living outside of Tatarstan. The same is true with Bashkortostan. So I do not think, perhaps if disintegration is going on and at the more or less advanced stages of disintegration, those elites will practically turn to secession from Russia. But also, you know, those republics are encircled by Russian regions, and they have no access to the outer world, unlike Siberia, unlike the Far East, unlike Kaliningrad, and even unlike the North Caucasus republics. So I do not think that ethnic factor will be the decisive one. The regional interests may be more important if disintegration process is going on.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry, we have to finish. But thank you all for coming, and if you are interested in this book, and if you would like to discuss some additional problems with Mr. Professor, with my colleagues, you are warmly welcome to do so. So thank you all for coming once again, and I would like to thank my perfect speakers and colleagues, and I think this was quite a successful evening, if I'm not wrong. So thank you, and have a nice time.